Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, most merciful, most gracious. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May the peace and blessings of Allah be with you all. My names are Sheikh Ibrahim Lithome. I am a religious scholar from Jamia Mosque in Nairobi and also a member of Arigato International Advisory Committee. I've been invited to this symposium, that is the Harvard Symposium, to share with you all participants the important role of faith leaders in preventing child sexual abuse and also helping using religious teachings to heal the victims of this crime. And I've prepared a short presentation in the form of PowerPoints, which I will share with you shortly. As you can see on your screen, the title of my presentation is The Importance of Faith Leaders in Preventing and Healing of Child Sexual Abuse. Ladies and gentlemen, child sexual abuse is a reality. And it is not limited to one country or a region. This is a global reality. And there are so many indicators to show that this is a reality. It is a real problem. We're not just imagining it, but it is there. For example, if you look at the rising number of cases of pedophiles, the rising number of defilement cases where children are involved, and also the rising number, and especially here in Africa, and here in Kenya specifically, there are so many girls who are subjected to harmful cultural practices like female genital mutilation, which involves the mutilation of the female genitalia, and also many cases of early and forced marriages. There's also a rising number of cases of child pornography and child prostitution. And I've given there a reference for those who would like to read more about the indicators of this reality. And one might ask, why did I begin by emphasizing that this is a reality? For the faith leaders to play their rightful role in preventing this crime, it is important for them to fully understand the nature of this reality and also the magnitude. And that's why I find it very important to emphasize that this is real and not imagined. Participants, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, as religious leaders, regardless of our faith traditions, we have the primary duty to ensure that we enjoy what is good. We also have a duty to prohibit what is evil and also ensure that there is justice for all. Remember, in our scriptures, we are told that we have to do justice because justice is close to godliness. And there can never be justice if the victims of injustice are not helped. So we must always help the victims of injustices. And child sexual abuse is an injustice to our children. As the custodians of divine religious teachings, all of us as faith leaders have a duty to use the relevant religious text, to use the relevant religious concepts to prevent child sexual abuse, and also to help the victims of these abuses through spiritual healing. Ladies and gentlemen, many of us are aware of the power of religion. Religion is a powerful tool. If used properly, then it will make this world a better place. So this is a very powerful tool that can be used properly, and it can help us prevent evils like child sexual abuse. And for me, I find religion to be a very powerful tool because it appeals to the emotions. Look at the things that we do as faithfuls in the name of religion, because we believe and we are convinced that what we are doing is right, then we'll stop at nothing. So you can imagine, if we use it the right way in preventing a crime like protecting our children from child sexual abuse and other evils that are affecting children, it will be a very effective tool. I'm not saying that religion should be should not be questioned, but to many people, religion is unquestionable. And again, the very fact that religion promises a reward beyond this world, that people can do what they believe is good without expecting returns in this world, makes religion a very powerful tool. And because religious leaders from the different faith traditions are the custodians of religious teachings, that places them in a very unique position to extract the relevant religious scriptures to complement other interventions, because we know there are administrative interventions, we have legal interventions, policy interventions. Religion will be a very powerful tool to complement all these interventions to prevent this evil crime against our children. I believe, just like a good doctor would do, you cannot treat a disease without first identifying the underlying root causes of that disease. I believe, and I think rightly so, for us to be able to effectively deal with child sexual abuse and prevent it, it is important that as faith leaders, we identify the underlying root causes of the abuse, and we should begin with our institutions. Ask ourselves, what is it that promotes child sexual abuse in our institution? And then look at other institutions. Then, in order to prevent effectively child sexual abuse, then we must effectively address these underlying root causes. Faith leaders have a duty to use religious institutions and the many platforms that we have access to identify the different cases of child sexual abuse. As religious leaders, we should also use other networks to identify victims of child sexual abuse, because many of them might keep quiet, they will not even want to report because of the stigma that is associated with this kind of crimes. After identifying these victims of child sexual abuse, then it is our duty to use the relevant religious teachings. For me, I would extract from the Quran, from the teachings of the Prophet, may peace be upon him, to help the victims of child sexual abuse so that they can recover from the physical and the emotional trauma that is caused by this kind of crime. We should also use the relevant religious text to help the victims overcome that trauma that results from the abuse. Remember, some of them might even think about revenging. Some of them might feel that they cannot fit back in society. But through spiritual healing of these victims, we can be able to help them reintegrate into society, forget or forgive those perpetrators, and maybe if some of them were thinking of revenge, then we can help them forgive the perpetrators of the offense. But when I say forgive, it doesn't mean that the law should not catch up with the perpetrators. And actually, we should be in the forefront as religious leaders in helping the law enforcement agencies in catching up with the perpetrators of this kind of offense so that they can be a lesson to others. As I said earlier, any effective intervention for preventing and healing victims of child sexual abuse must effectively address all the underlying root causes. And I think we'll be lying to ourselves if we say that faith leaders can work on their own. In fact, no single stakeholder in this regard can be able to effectively address the problem. So as faith leaders, we need to identify other strategic partners in order for us to effectively prevent and help the victims of child sexual abuse heal. So we need, number one, to identify who are these strategic partners. And then number two, after identifying them, we need to identify the role that each stakeholder or partner will play. And I've given a few examples there. We know that we need government institutions like the law enforcement agencies. These are under government. We need the judiciary for justice, for the administration of justice. We need also those who are in charge of the implementation of policy. So we need to identify governments and work closely with them as strategic partners in preventing and also helping the victims of child sexual abuse in healing. Families are also very important. Remember, the primary institution that is expected to give care to children is families. So as faith leaders, we need to identify and work closely with families in preventing child sexual abuse. And we know sometimes these crimes even happen in families. They are perpetrated by people who are close to the children, people that the children trust. So we need to work closely with families and build their capacity in preventing these crimes happening within the families, within the neighborhood, and the rest. Media is also a very important strategic partner in preventing child sexual abuse, like in exposing the perpetrators of child sexual abuse and also sensitizing the communities. So media is a very powerful institution or a partner that faith leaders need to work with. Institutions of learning, that is schools, colleges, and other institutions where children interact with grown-ups. We need to sensitize those who are in charge of children, those who have the responsibility of training children and nurturing them, to keep on talking about these vices, child sexual abuse, and also try to build the capacity of the children to protect themselves against potential abusers, sexual abusers of children. Then finally, and this is very unfortunate, we have some forms of child sexual abuse cases that are linked with religion. And I will say here without fear of any contradiction, for example, in Islam, there are so many people who are still perpetrating, who are still subjecting girls to harmful cultural practices like female genital mutilation in the name of religion, using religion to justify this kind of crime against children. There are also other people who would use religion to justify things like early and forced marriages. These, no doubt, are forms of child sexual abuse cases. So it is important for religious leaders to come out clearly and delink these practices from religion. It is important that they come out with strong evidence from the religious teachings to show that there is no way religion can be used to justify this kind of sexual abuses against children. And for further reading, kindly read a book that was written in 2008 entitled Delinking Female Genital Mutilation or Cutting from Islam. Finally, we need to accept one reality. All of us as faith leaders are not at the same level. Some faith leaders might not see this as a priority. So it is important that faith leaders who already consider addressing child sexual abuse as a priority, and that as faith leaders, we have an important role to play in preventing this crime, we need to think about bringing on board other faith leaders so that more of us can be involved in this. In fact, every faith leader should be involved in preventing child sexual abuse. So we need to sensitize other faith leaders on their critical role in addressing child sexual abuse. Actually, I would dare say that they need to be reminded that we are answerable before God if we do not play that role of addressing child sexual abuse. And we have so many forums. So we need to sensitize faith leaders to that we have so many forums and platforms that no other sector of society has. For example, on Friday, how many Muslims come to the mosque where I preach? How many faithfuls come to the church on Sunday or on Saturday to attend in a temple or any other religious institution? So we sensitize faith leaders on the importance of making use of all these very important platforms and very effective platforms that are available to us. There is also need to sensitize them that we have a duty as faith leaders to delink all forms of child sexual abuse from religion. No religion at all, no authentic religion would advocate for child sexual abuse, and therefore there is need to sensitize all faith leaders to delink religion from these forms of abuse. I would also suggest that there is need to start a local movement for sustainability. There is need within each locality for faith leaders to come together and come up with a movement that is specifically charged with addressing this issue. And I've even suggested here a name, a movement that we'll call Building Resilience Against Child Sexual Abuse, BRAXA, something like that. And as the gatekeepers in the communities, faith leaders should use every opportunity to address the problem. So when giving sermons, when you're invited maybe to give a talk in a wedding or in a burial, every opportunity that we have as faith leaders, and we have so many opportunities because we are trusted by the community, we should use that opportunity to sensitize the community, to discuss this problem with a view of looking for lasting solution. So we know that as faith leaders, we easily talk about prayer. Yes, God will help us, but God helps those who help themselves. So we need to take the initiative even as we pray. Thank you very much, and God bless you all. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May the peace and blessings of Allah be with you all. Thank you.
My respect to venerables and reverence. Warm greetings from Thailand. I am very honored and very happy to be part of this symposium. Why is it so important for me to attend this particular symposium? Let me give you way back, 1983. That was the first time I was invited to Harvard University to attend a conference on women, religion, and social changes. The host at that time, Professor Diana Ek, she did not know me personally, but she was looking for someone to speak on the title of the paper, Future of Bhikkhuni Ordination in Thailand. Bhikkhuni means fully ordained nuns. At that time, there was only one Bhikkhuni in this whole country. That was my mother, Venerable Woramai Kabir Singh. She was ordained from Taiwan. As I attended the conference, I didn't realize that that conference was going to be a stepping stone for me to be what I am now. The conference was a closed conference. They invited only the leading activist feminists from all over the country. And the discussion which was going on in this conference was very open, very moving, to bring out the issues of exploitation of women from different parts of the world. I was shocked and I was moved to realize the suffering of sentient beings to that extent, to the great extent that we were exposed at the conference. It was the first time that I started looking within myself. As an academic, I was living very comfortably in this ivory tower, doing nothing to bring about social changes. I, a woman in religion and social changes, I was the only one in my country to come back with a PhD, particularly with my research on the ordination of women. Yet, I was not doing anything to bring about social changes. So that conference in Harvard, at Harvard University, was my turning point. I decided 1983 to come down from the ivory tower and start being active to bring about proper information on ordination of women. Slowly as things turned, in the year 2001, I took ordination. I became ordained. I became a monastic. Something happened at this ordination. when you put on the robe, you shave your head. As you walk out, the very first day I walk out, people from on the street came and bowed to my feet. I was more than shocked, to realize that you have such great faith from the people all around. So slowly, I was more and more exposed to the suffering of women, particularly on sexual abuse issues. This went on, and it was the year, that year, 2003, I was fully ordained. And very interestingly, Harvard University organized another conference. And that conference, they invited the women they have invited earlier in 1983. All the women came together again, but this time I looked very different from all of them. As I was shaved and I put on the robe, some of them recognized me right away, but some of them could not recognize me because they could not imagine that I, as a professor leading a very comfortable lay life, would actually be committed enough to lead this monastic life. So I see that ordination is something very important. You cannot talk about ordination only and bring about social changes. I have myself to be ordained. I have myself to be committed to what I was talking about, what I studied so much. So this is a move from academic person to be committed in social issues, to be a social activist, to move so that you really bring about social changes in my context, in my country. Now, for almost 4 decades, again, I'm invited to participate in this symposium on the role of faith leaders, to talk about how we can protect, how we can heal child sexual abuse. This is, again, within that realm of social changes. The key word that I read, faith leaders, sex, child and sex, and sexual abuse. These are the key words that we could start. I would like to pick on the first one, faith leaders. As faith leaders, how are we committed? How are we committed to our profession, so to say? How are we committed to our profession? As I mentioned earlier, when I was ordained, how people suddenly pay you great respect. I went into myself and asked, what is a commitment? When I was ordained, I made a pronouncement to my teacher, to my preceptor, that I will make enlightenment real in my life. Enlightenment is our spiritual goal, is Buddhist spiritual goal. Then I also said, I will try my best to lessen suffering. Only when I lessen suffering within myself, only then I can speak to my people. So this commitment is very important. So here we are talking about faith leaders to protect, to heal those who are abused. How we ourselves as faith leaders, how committed we are to our path. You may think about we are going to come together and write something like a guidebook, a handbook, so that to help monastics, to help the fathers or the sisters to handle cases of victims. To me, no. To me, when you have victims sitting in front of you, you have to listen to them very carefully. Listening to them very carefully in Buddhist training, it is called listening, pure listening. This pure listening is listening without I, listening without making judgment, listening by really feeling the suffering the person is telling you, Go into the depth of pain. Feel the pain within them. And now that pain becomes pain that you could actually feel. You want to cry? Yes, you can cry. Don't hold back that you are faith leaders, so therefore you should not show your tears. Show your tears. Tears is made for you to cry. So feel truly the pain that the victims are suffering. Only when you really feel the pain of what they are going through, only then we as faith leaders can help them. When you actually feel the pain, they know that you are not faking it. They know that you could feel the pain that they are feeling. At that moment, you gain trust. In order for you to do the healing, to go to the step of healing, healing does not happen unless you have trust, unless you gain trust. So from this stage, from this step onward, what are you to say to them? You don't have to say anything. Allow divinity to flow from you, from within, and reach out to them. It could be physical, just holding hands, physical hug, to reassure them that you will be with them through this passage of suffering and coming out of suffering. That is what faith leaders are for. So therefore, at this gathering, at this symposium, I have great trust in faith leaders that they are committed to what they are. They are committed to the divinity, and they are working from that realm to extend themselves to reach out for those who need help. So I think the change that I went through from Harvard University in 1983, that happened to me as a person. And because I am committed, that's why I bring about ordination of women in my country. In the year 1983, there was only one person ordained, that's my mother. 20 years after that, I was ordained. And I was the first in the movement to bring women into this ordination. It all happened from my experience at Harvard University. So this symposium, I hope that it is going to be yet another point of time that from now on, there is going to be a real change. From now on, faith leaders will shift from their comfortable zone to reach out for those who are exploited, those who feel the suffering, and you could feel their suffering. Then we can come together and we can allow divinity to flow from us out to them. Let today be a start for Harvard University again to be the center to make about this change that will happen in society, to bring about the true happiness in humanity. Let me give you a chanting, a Buddhist chanting for healing. Om Namo Bhagavate Pai Sachiya Guru Vaituriya Praparashaya Tathakataya Aratate Samyak Samputaya Tattayatha. Om Pai Sachiye Maha Pai Sachiye Raja Samuttakate Bodhi Swaha. And my second chanting is for the happiness of all. I ask the blessing from the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha to provide all of us with happiness. Bhavatu sappha manghalang rakhantu sappha devata sappha buddhanupavena sappha dhammanupavena sappha sanghanupavena satha soti bhavantu te. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Hello, my name is Hans Zollner. I'm a German Jesuit and the president of the Center for Child Protection at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. I'm very appreciative to be able to address you all at this symposium, Faith and Flourishing, organized by Harvard University. When considering the role that faith communities have in bringing about healing from and prevention of sexual abuse, my travels to about 70 countries on all continents have largely influenced my belief that these communities, faith communities, can, in fact, have a major impact on the greater communities they serve. They can offer safety for those who are vulnerable and at risk of being abused, and offer a shelter for those in need. In all countries I've been, I've seen that both faith leaders and those who are involved as boots on the ground are quite sensitive to this reality of abuse and are quite aware of the risks to youth and other vulnerable people. Faith communities have a strong sense of awareness that they should work hard to create safe spaces for all. People of all religions express that their faith plays a vital part in their daily life and value systems, so this deep faith can actually work as a motivator to keep others safe. Furthermore, faith institutions can offer services like education on prevention, intervention, and safeguarding in general. The academic contribution we can make working together across various religious sectors can be much more productive and thorough than if we were to each act alone. We need to establish a common understanding of how we can collaborate and even educate professionals like psychologists, teachers, medical personnel, and religious leaders, all the way up to those working for companies, governments, and NGOs. On so many levels, it is necessary that individuals are able to recognize signs of abuse, know how to intervene and report abuse, and how to help survivors who belong to our communities. By listening to those who have been hurt so grievously, we begin to understand better why it is so important for faith communities to step up and acknowledge the harm that has been done in their midst. Faith communities can offer individuals resources to help them heal from abuse as well, shall they seek it. We know that in some countries the issue of abuse has only yet begun to be addressed, whereas in other countries the awareness has been ongoing for decades. Those cultures which have just begun or have yet to begin addressing sexual abuse can certainly learn much from others, from other cultures, religions, and governments on how to intervene, prevent, and deal with abuse as it comes to the fore. Utilizing materials and instruments produced in many languages around the world from different faith communities, institutions, is of exponential help to the common cause of educating on the topic of abuse and of creating a safe space for children and other vulnerable people. Faith is something that is found in the hearts of many, whether a school teacher or the leader of a country, and that faith serves as a guide to protecting others. Whether a teacher simply looking after and guarding children on school grounds, or a president making policies which address abuse in their country, his or her faith most certainly influences their stance on this topic and their perspective on the seriousness. Religions can come together in the fight of sexual abuse of men, women, and children. I've seen this here in Rome in 2017, when the Congress on Child Dignity in the Digital World was held. People of all faiths came to exchange their own perspectives on this topic, and it was, in my opinion, a major step in the field of child protection and safeguarding. This 3-day Congress here at the Gregorian University helped us to understand that only when we work together we can have a truly lasting and vast impact. So, what can we do as a community of believers belonging to different faiths? I think this pandemic has shown that there are challenges that are much bigger than any one person, one religion, one country, one profession. By working together from different angles and areas of expertise, we can each bring to the table specialized skills and profound perspectives to understand the roots of abuse and work toward healing. As faith communities, we know how to reach the deepest motivations and inner workings of human beings. Therefore, it is important to instill in others the desire to create safe environments in every aspect of our lives, in our schools, workplaces, places of worship, community centers, and so forth. Together, we are one human race, and I believe that together, there is much we can achieve. Across religions, political affiliations, cultures, and continents, we need to focus on our shared communal values and build on them. Upon these shared communal values, we can build universal bonds, not just for us today, but for future generations. Yes, it is possible. We can look within ourselves and know why it is that we do good for others, without asking anything in return, simply because we care about our fellow human beings. I believe that faith communities can be leaders in this journey toward a safer world. Of course, this journey will be met with resistance and challenges, both within ourselves and our own faith communities, as well as in the world at large. By expressing each one's own limitations and strengths, we can steadily make our way toward a safer world for us, for the children in this world, and for the future. With God's help, there is much we can achieve. That is my hope, and that is our common commitment.
Hello, I'm Russell Moore, and I've been working in the area of sexual abuse, church sexual assault within evangelical Christianity in the United States, and specifically the Southern Baptist Convention. One of the things that comes to mind every time that I think about this issue is a conversation between the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr and James Baldwin in the 1960s, was printed in the Christian Century and then has been reprinted in other places since, a conversation about the face of Jesus. And specifically, it was about the horrific terrorist attack upon the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham in 1963. An attack by white supremacists that left 4 young girls on their way to Sunday school murdered, and also devastated the building, and specifically a stained glass window of Jesus as Good Shepherd with the face of Jesus blown out by the bombs. What Niebuhr and Baldwin were grappling with is the metaphor of that faceless Jesus in a site of such murder and such horrific assault upon children and others. Where was God? Was the face of Jesus silenced in light of this evil? And of course, both Niebuhr and Baldwin had been grappling with these questions for a long time. Baldwin had written extensively about the sort of evil that exists in Jim Crow South, and specifically in terms of some religious expressions within the Jim Crow South. And Reinhold Niebuhr, of course, had written extensively on what does it mean to be Christian in a world that is post-Holocaust, in the middle of the Cold War, filled with evils. And that's a good question. The sort of lament that went out from 16th Street Baptist Church, the sort of horror that repeats itself over and over and over again, does indeed come down to that question of whether there is a silence of God and whether there is, in fact, a good shepherd. Now, when we're talking about issues of church sexual abuse, and specifically within an evangelical context, we're understanding that we don't see any safe harbor in American life from this sort of evil. We've seen the Jeffrey Epstein cases. We've seen the Boy Scouts. We've seen the Roman Catholic Church and the cover-ups there. And then in the Houston Chronicle of a couple of years ago, 700 survivors of church sexual abuse, some as young as 3 years old, all within the context of Southern Baptist churches affiliated with the Southern Baptist Convention. And many would ask, looking at all this horror, where in fact is the face of Jesus? So one of the things that I'm driven to constantly in this conversation is an account in the Gospel of John, one of the sacred scriptures for all Christians. And in this account, we see a situation of a man who's been blind from birth. And when Jesus heals him, the text says that the religious leaders are immediately suspicious because of this violating religious rules that's happening on the Sabbath. These were people who were concerned more with the structures than they were with the fact that this man was suffering and had been born blind. As a matter of fact, there was the threat in this narrative to cast him out from the community, a sort of exile of shaming him and putting him aside. And Jesus then immediately turns to a conversation in the Gospel of John that most Christians know in some way or other, if only in terms of stained glass or readings at funerals, of Jesus as shepherd, as good shepherd. But what I often argue in evangelical Christian contexts is that the language that Jesus uses here is shocking beyond the platitudes that one would hear in times of needed comfort. It's shocking. And what he is saying here is immediately relevant to why there is a crisis of sexual abuse in evangelical Christianity and elsewhere, and how to begin to address it. And there's several things that I would like for us to look at. First is, Jesus uses this language, used elsewhere and throughout the canon, of lambs, of sheep, young sheep. This is language of vulnerability. So often the sheep metaphor used in Ezekiel or elsewhere is speaking in terms of the people of God as a multitude who are being guarded and who are being shepherded. But Jesus specifically uses this in terms of lamb, language also that's going to show up in the rest of the New Testament. Language of vulnerability. A lamb is an animal with no natural defenses against predators, an animal that is intensely vulnerable. Now, this is one of the areas of Jesus' teaching that is a word of contradiction to almost every cultural system in the history of the world, and to many of the cultural systems that show up even within a church context. No sports team wants lamb as a mascot. They might want ram as a mascot, but not lamb, because there is a sense of shame that comes along with vulnerability, of being defenseless, it seems, in a world where strength and winning and social Darwinism are what seem to matter. But what Jesus does is to come in and to redefine not only human beings, but also himself as a lamb who was slain in terms of a vulnerability that within itself carries power. Now, one of the reasons that there is a crisis of sexual abuse within churches is this simultaneous belief that churches are invulnerable. And so you will have people who will say things along the lines of, these are statistically such small numbers of cases, or we'll say something along the lines of, this is something that happens in the outside world. So a lot of culture war rhetoric would be used against say, scandals that emerge in Hollywood, while there sometimes is a muted response to what takes place within the church. Or Christians will sometimes say, well, that's something that can happen in the Roman Catholic Church, or it's something that can happen in some other theological tribe than mine. But one of the things that we have seen in terms of church sexual abuse is that there is no theological statement or ecclesial structure that by themselves can rid a church of sexual abuse. Instead, any theological system can be weaponized. So the question will sometimes be, well, the Roman Catholic Church has a strong system of hierarchy, bishops and archbishops and cardinals. What do we see? We see sexual abuse crisis throughout the 20th century and early 21st century. On the other hand, many evangelical networks of churches are bottom-up, non-hierarchical systems of autonomous churches where the ultimate accountability is within the church itself. That does not cure the problem. Instead, it exists just as much there. So regardless really of where a church falls on the theological spectrum, what sorts of ecclesial structures are present, these things are there. So when Jesus is speaking of vulnerability, the first step is to understand and to know vulnerability, to know that we are vulnerable. There is no way to say this is someone else's problem, which is why churches we're encouraging to begin preventative measures, even if they do not know of any cases that have taken place within their church, or if it is a church plant that is just starting, so that there is detailed information written out about these are the preventative measures we're going to take in terms of vetting volunteers and employees within the church. These are the reporting standards that we're going to have so that if there is an allegation of sexual abuse or sexual assault, we are not only dealing with it as an internal church matter, but we also understand that there is a responsibility for the civil government given in Romans chapter 13, and so civil government must be alerted immediately. These are the ways that we're going to care for those who have survived sexual abuse and sexual assault, whether that's within our congregation or some other congregation. Having these measures in place, not just in response to a crisis, but to go ahead and in front of any potential crisis to try to stop it. We understand our vulnerability, and we do not turn our heads away from those who are vulnerable, and particularly vulnerable. But instead, as Jesus says, we stand up for them, we care for them, we stand with them. So the language of lambs Jesus uses. He also, though, uses the language of predators. And that's what usually doesn't come up when we're thinking of these stained glass images of Jesus as good shepherd. Language of wolf. This is language that's going to be used later on in the Apostle Paul as he speaks to the early churches in the first century world. But Jesus speaks specifically in terms of predators, those who would prey upon vulnerability and destroy the lambs, but also of thieves and robbers, those who would come in, he says, not through the gate. They're coming in instead through another way. And what this is referring to is the ability to abuse trust. So one of the reasons why churches sometimes can be especially vulnerable to sexual assault and sexual abuse is not just a church's sense of invulnerability, but also a church's tendency to trust authority, to trust those who know the right words to say, and to have this understanding of grace that is not a biblical understanding of grace, but is instead grace that is used as cover-up. Jesus here warns that there are going to be people like this. So when Jesus says, I'm leading my sheep, I don't lead them with coercion. I don't lead them in order to benefit myself. I lead them instead with my voice, but there will be others who will do otherwise. So one of the most enraging things about some of the aspects of sexual abuse that have shown up in evangelical and also in Roman Catholic settings is the language of Christian theology and Christian piety that can be weaponized by predators. Don't tell anyone about this because only God would understand what's happening here. Or you and I are fighting spiritual warfare here. We have to keep it just between us. Or a blaming of the victim for what is happening to the victim. And often, after being caught, a sexual predator will appeal to the account of King David after the incident with Bathsheba, appeal to grace as a way often to get right back into situations of trust that are going to be abused again. Now, the Christian gospel is really clear that the blood of Christ can forgive any sin. That does not mean a lack of accountability, and it certainly does not mean cover-ups. So if an understanding of the gospel means for someone that rapists and sexual offenders can still have access to those that they can harm, one does not understand the gospel of Jesus Christ. Jesus warns about this and warns that what's behind all of this is a drivenness by the appetite. Now, these are those who come to kill and to destroy. So if you think about the way that often sexual predation takes place, abuse takes place within a church context, there is almost this, just as the scripture will speak of an antichrist that seeks to mirror some of the actions of Jesus, but to turn them to another end. These are those who often are doing what seems to be shepherding, when in fact they're grooming and waiting patiently for the time in which they can act. They know how to be not detectable. They know how to appeal to psychological and spiritual vulnerabilities, and they're driven along by the appetites. A church has to be fully cognizant of this, and a church also has to understand that sexual abuse and sexual assault is not a public relations problem. Sexual abuse and sexual assault is a problem of injustice and wickedness and preying upon the vulnerable and a contradiction of the gospel of Jesus Christ. If a church seeks to operate out of a sense of public relations, then what the church will want to do is to say, we want to keep this internal, because if we were to talk about this publicly, it would cause people not to trust our church, or maybe not to trust Christianity, or maybe not to trust Jesus. And so we cover this up. That is a complete contradiction to the first century teachings of Jesus himself, who never calls for cover-up of sin, who always calls for bringing what is hidden into the light, what is whispered in the corners to be shouted from the rooftops. And so this understanding of hiding sexual abuse and sexual assault is not about protecting Jesus, but fighting Jesus. And often what takes place is that predatory systems, or systems that are vulnerable to being manipulated by predators, will often do exactly what we saw in John chapter 9, of seeking to weaponize shame against survivors and victims as though they are sexual sinners. So you have a sense in which often those who have survived sexual abuse in a church context will feel themselves, wrongly, but will feel themselves to be responsible. Sometimes an abuser will use the language of the account of Potiphar's wife in the book of Genesis, who accused Joseph of attempting to sexually approach her. Or they'll use language of temptresses and Jezebels and all sorts of other biblical language taken wrongly out of context in order to put the responsibility upon the victim. And this furthers the abuse that has taken place. This, again, when Jesus uses this language of shepherd, it's in immediate contrast. It's echoing what the prophet Ezekiel said. When in Ezekiel 34, speaking to the religious structures, the prophet said, "The weak you have not strengthened, the sick you have not healed, the injured you have not bound up, the strayed you have not brought back, the lost you have not sought, and with force and with harshness you have used them." A church is not to be a transactional arrangement. A church is not to be a business. A church is certainly not to be a predatory network. A church exists to live out the gospel of Jesus Christ, to represent the body of Christ, and to protect those who are there serving Christ. So when Jesus then uses this language of shepherd, and he applies it to himself as a good shepherd, the clear teaching there is that he knows his sheep. He knows every one of them. He knows their voices. He is not seeking to manipulate them. He is not seeking to shame them. He is not seeking to cover up what has happened to them. He is not arguing that what has happened is their fault. Instead, he is standing against the predators and against those who would use even religious things in order to prey upon people. So he's speaking of himself in terms of Psalm 23, language of the Lord as my shepherd, and speaking of himself as one who lays down his life for the sheep. When a church understands what this means as it relates to sexual abuse and sexual assault, those churches are going to understand that there are certain things we have to do immediately. We have to put policies in place. We have to stand with those who are vulnerable. We have to verbally say to a congregation, if any of you have lived through something like this, here are the people that you can safely talk to. Church has to have ways of ministering to survivors of sexual abuse in the aftermath. And a church has to fully disclose to the congregation and to the outside world when there is an issue of sexual abuse and sexual assault. This is a matter of justice, what Jesus has called us to do. It also is a matter of credibility, because often what has taken place is that people have seen sexual abuse in church contexts, places that they trusted, and they have come away believing this represents Jesus himself. A church has no credibility when that is the case. So instead, what the church has to do in the crisis of sexual abuse is to seek to ongoingly address these places of potential vulnerability in their systems. Who can come in through the side door? That's not a once and for all process. That has to be constantly reevaluated by a church, with church leadership saying to the congregation, let us know when you see potential loopholes and problems here. That is not a criticism of our church. That is not sowing dissension. That is helping us to do better to protect children and vulnerable people. That has to be an ongoing process of constantly being willing to revise policies, and more than that, to constantly be shaping the culture of a congregation to understand our responsibilities. That we are the people who, in the crisis of sexual abuse, need to be following Jesus and not allowing ourselves to be driven by others. And we need to be able to say, the Lord is my shepherd, with credibility and with conviction. Thank you.
Namaste. I would like to take a moment and thank the organizers for creating a space for us service providers and faith leaders to voice our concerns and share our thoughts on this pandemic of child sexual abuse, or CSA. CSA is a major threat to our community and communities at large, especially because it is an insidious epidemic which leaves an indelible mark on the victim survivor. According to the CDC, 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 13 boys will experience child sexual abuse at some point in their childhood. However, we service providers know that the number is much higher, as it is a highly underreported crime. All crimes are heinous in their own rights, but CSA is particularly troubling, as most often the perpetrators are not only known to the survivors, but also are the ones who have been charged with their caregiving and or protection. 91% of child sexual abuse is perpetrated by someone the child knows. Incest, intrafamilial abuse accounts for 1/3 of all CSA. CSA intersects with other forms of violence, like emotional, physical, and verbal abuse, being raised in a domestic violence household, and or witnessing any kind of violence makes a child more susceptible. Natural disasters, war, and poverty raise the risk for being targeted. Being differently abled and or being neurodivergent makes one vulnerable. However, CSA is not limited to the so-called vulnerable children. It cuts across all sections of society, faith communities, and socioeconomic statuses. It is not gender-specific either, so all children are equally vulnerable. Like most faith communities, the Hindu community is not immune either. Yet, it pains me to say that there is a lack of acknowledgement within the community. Here in the USA, the Hindu community strives to adhere to their model minority status and often overlooks the abuse that takes place. I feel as the community thrives and attains prominence, the pressure on the members to excel increases, and so does the denial. The deafening silence, the lack of acknowledgement, the cover-ups often creates a culture where the abuse thrives. This is by no means an effort to put a culture or faith on trial, but an humble effort to educate en masse and save our children. We must stop the ability for perpetrators to hide behind cultural facade. Most Hindu temples are independently run by a group of community members, priests, and faith leaders. They may have an affiliation to a parent organization, but fundamentally operate as individual institutions with their own boards, set of rules and laws. Volunteers play a big role in running these temples. Priests, lay leaders, and volunteers often have unrestricted access to children and are seldom monitored. This is not to say that every individual who comes in contact with a child is an abuser, but I can most certainly say that all children are potential victims, as the perpetrators are everywhere and they present themselves in various forms. Most Hindu temples, at least the ones that I have been to, offer ritualistic services and discourses on religious texts, celebrating the divine on regular and special days. I'm yet to hear a priest or a Hindu leader talk directly about any types of abuse and or condemn them while talking to the devotees. There are 2 types of actions in this world. One is the act of commission, and the other one is the act of omission. The one who is committing the crime and the one who failed to hold the perpetrators liable are equally responsible for causing harm. Chastity and purity are extremely valued in the Hindu community, and most often the onus is on the girls or women to protect themselves. Many times, the concept of karma is used to silence a victim. It is insinuated that they must have done something wrong in their past lives to incur this fate. Many times, one hears in the sacred places that suffering redeems us. So we need to be patient, and eventually we will be delivered. This prevents survivors from speaking up as they feel they are going to be ostracized, criticized, and stigmatized by the community. This results in a great deal of shame that they must carry throughout their lives. Shame and guilt are very sticky emotions that riddle survivors for a long period of time. Some become angry, and due to a lack of a supportive community and or an appropriate container for such an emotion, their anger often turns inward, resulting in self-destructive behaviors like addiction, self-harm, chronic suicidality, etc. The mental health impact is huge. The wall of silence and secrecy within the Hindu community and elsewhere needs to be dismantled. We have to hold perpetrators accountable, and we must send a clear message to all survivors that they were not responsible for the abuse. We need to apologize and accept responsibility where applicable for our ignorance and our failure to protect. A heartfelt apology goes a long way and can aid in healing the trauma. As a service provider, I bear witness to the pain and suffering of the survivors on a daily basis. The trauma is paralyzing, and it prevents the survivors from living their lives to the fullest. After trauma strikes, the world becomes an unsafe space for survivors. They feel less secure in their own bodies and homes. They become insecure about their goals and desires. Trauma is a wound that is hard to heal, though regaining functionality is possible and absolutely attainable. We need to make space for survivors to be able to reach out to, be reassured, and find support. There is hope, but the biggest hope lies in prevention. Religion for many is the ultimate refuge and the source of strength in their darkest hours. If the victim has been raised within the faith tradition and the faith community fails to respond, the victim often internalizes the failure as a rejection by God and often feels disenfranchised, powerless, and untethered. Victims often wonder if the assault is a punishment from God and what did they do to deserve that. It leaves them with little or no resources to turn to. Hence, it is paramount that we reassure the survivors and our communities that we will be there to support and guide them faithfully. The very concept of karma can be used to urge the community members to step up and to report. And in doing so, they will be fulfilling their duty to the community and the children. Teachings from the Mahabharata and other religious texts can be used to highlight the fact that only by upholding their duty of protecting the children, the vulnerable, can a society be created where everyone thrives and true dharma prevails. I believe it is our sacred duty to protect our children. One of the most important injunctions for a Hindu is Ma Himshat Sarvabhutani, no injury or violence to others. The Hindu text, the laws of Manu, which has been often quoted and misquoted, mandates that children are to be protected and the perpetrators to be severely punished. If that is the mandate, then why are we not speaking up? I urge the faith leaders to acknowledge the fact that our community is not immune. I urge them to address the devotees and to act when they become privy to such information. It is imperative for our faith leaders to speak up and speak out. They must listen when the survivors speak. Break the silence and believe the victim. It is fundamental to recovery. Do not dismiss a complaint by saying that the child is acting up or that they are blaming others to cover their own delinquent behavior. Refrain from questioning and blaming, as it can further the shame that the survivors already feel. Responsibility for an assault does not lie with the victim. Responsibility lies with the failure of the societal systems of protection. God does not shun victims no matter what. We remain a child of God. Confronting abusers directly may pose some risk to some survivors, and it may not be for everyone. Remember, safety is of utmost importance. Messaging is key and language is important. Collaborating with organizations who work to educate and present information with regards to CSA is not admitting guilt nor insinuating that something is wrong with the faith institution. Education about CSA does not lead to CSA. In fact, it can prevent it. Please allow such organizations or groups who work to end CSA to provide training sessions to priests, staff members, and volunteers. It will be one large step in the right direction. Information can be made available in the form of pamphlets and be left side by side in the lobbies with spiritual calendars of upcoming events. Even smaller temples can post information about hotlines in the restrooms. These measures will indicate to the survivors that help is available, and the faith community is eager to stand with them and not condemn them. Most importantly, denouncing such acts from the outset, clearly stating that the perpetrators will be held accountable, and avoiding victim blaming is what we need. Faith and faith-based institutions should be a safe space for renewal and growth that fosters healing. We are all charged with the protection of the most innocent beings in our society, and we can create a safe place for our children to disclose, to heal, and to thrive, only if we care. Namaste.